Picture a child born into unimaginable wealth, a sprawling estate, endless rooms, a dedicated staff waiting on their every whim from day one. To most of us, it looks like a fairy tale. The ultimate head start. We expect this child to grow up grateful. We expect them to become a capable, well-rounded leader. But step inside the house. Look a little closer. The grand halls are totally silent. The parents are missing. When they're home, they are cold, distant. There's no warmth here. Just the quiet mechanical hum of hired help. For this child, human connection isn't love, it is service. Every single command is obeyed. Every desire is met without friction. They never hear the word no. They never face real resistance. It looks like extreme luxury, but in reality, it is a gilded cage of profound neglect. Watch this child as they grow. They move from the cold nursery to isolated elite schools. They are surrounded only by others exactly like them. Friendships are not real. They are calculated moves to protect a family legacy. What exactly happens to a human mind raised in this kind of isolation? What happens when every person you meet is either a servant to command or a rival to conquer? We assume this system trains the stewards of our society, but it actually does the exact opposite. It acts as a ruthless filter. It strips away basic empathy. It rewards pure, unchecked ego. And the most unsettling part, this perfectly engineered machine is choosing the exact people who will eventually run our world. So to understand exactly how this machinery of isolation operates in the real world, the clinical literature that we're examining today for this deep dive provides some intensely vivid composite scenarios.
Yeah, these are models built directly from the psychological data.
Right. So let's just step right into one of these scenarios to kind of anchor our discussion for you listening.
Yeah.
The nursery at a sprawling Connecticut estate. It's vast, it's impeccably curated, and it is just suffocatingly silent.
That silence is a huge indicator.
Exactly. And 7-year-old Julian is sitting on this priceless Persian rug, and he's staring down at the shattered pieces of a porcelain horse that he had, just accidentally knocked off his eye table.
Right.
But the thing is, he isn't crying because he's hurt. He's crying because he wants his mother. And when his mother, Eleanor, finally enters the room, and she's flanked by her personal assistant, dressed in this meticulously tailored, pearl-beaded gala gown, she doesn't kneel down.
No, of course not.
She doesn't check Julian's hands for cuts. She doesn't pull him into a hug to soothe his panic. She merely glances at the wreckage on the floor, lets out this sharp sigh, and says, "Julian, we do not make scenes, and we certainly do not weep over replaceable things. Have Maria clean this up. Wash your face."
Wow, just completely chilling.
And Maria, the housekeeper, who has functionally raised Julian more than his actual parents ever did, is watching from the doorway. She sees the boy's shoulders stiffen.
Yeah.
The tears just stop abruptly, retreating behind this sudden chilling blankness. Julian nods perfectly. He has learned his lesson.
He adapted.
Right, he adapted. But here is the terrifying part of this clinical model. 20 years later, Marie would see that exact same blank, polished smile on television. Yeah. Only this time, it's Julian, as a 30-something tech conglomerate CEO, calmly and impeccably announcing the termination of 10,000 employees. The boy hadn't just learned to hide his emotional pain that day on the rug. He learned a far more destructive lesson. He learned that other people's pain, much like shattered porcelain, is simply a mess for the help to clean up.
Yeah, because it is a profound, almost mechanical psychological process that begins in environments exactly like that hypothetical Connecticut nursery.
Yeah.
When we examine the hard clinical psychological findings regarding heavily affluent families.
And we're talking about a specific income bracket here, right?
Specifically, the data zeroing in on households with income starting over $120,000 to $160,000 and scaling rapidly upward from there.
Okay.
When we look at that bracket, we uncover a completely counterintuitive reality. The general societal assumption, the one we all kind of share, is that immense wealth acts as a supreme buffer.
Right, like it protects you.
We assume it insulates children from the traumas, the stresses, and the deprivations of normal human development. But the clinical data tells a starkly different story. Adolescents raised in these highly affluent, high-pressure environments exhibit debilitating neuroses at unexpectedly massive rates.
Like higher than average?
Much higher in certain categories. We are not just talking about mild teenage angst here. We are talking about clinical depression, severe generalized anxiety disorders, and really high rates of self-harm.
Oh.
And when psychologists trace the etiology of these neuroses, it consistently points back to two key indicators that are perfectly illustrated in Julian's story.
The pressure in the parents.
Immense, suffocating achievement pressure coupled with severe systemic emotional isolation from the parents.
I have to stop you there and push back back on that foundational idea because it really challenges how we view societal structures. I mean, if you're listening to this, you usually think of wealth as the ultimate safety net, right? It buys the best pediatricians, the best tutors, the safest neighborhoods. But what you're describing doesn't sound like a safety net at all. It sounds like a sensory deprivation tank for empathy. If human connection is entirely replaced by transactional service-like, if the person wiping your tears is literally on a payroll, and the person judging your worth is a parent demanding absolute perfection, how does a child even learn what a peer is? How do they develop a baseline understanding of unconditional human value?
The devastating truth is that they often just don't. They do not learn what a peer is in any meaningful, reciprocal, emotional sense. In these intensely affluent and physically isolated environments, external accomplishments completely replace human agency and internal emotional happiness. The parents in these demographics might be physically present on occasion,
Like showing up for the prestigious prep school graduation?
Right, or the elite sporting event where other wealthy parents are watching. But they are profoundly emotionally absent. The clinical literature frequently highlights that the mothers and fathers themselves in these affluent households report unexpectedly high rates of hidden depression, anxiety, and extreme social loneliness.
No, they're miserable too.
They are trapped in their own gilded cages of societal expectation. So the child is constantly observing adult role models who prioritize a flawless, effortless image of perfection in high society over genuine, messy, emotional connection.
Oh, so for the child in this environment, love is entirely conditional.
Purely transactional. It is based on prestige, the accumulation of money, getting into the right Ivy League school, wearing the right clothes, or seamlessly maintaining the public family legacy.
So when a child is raised from infancy to view themselves not as a human being worthy of inherent love, but merely as an asset to be managed for brand optimization.
Yes, a brand asset.
Right. And when every single person around them is either a paid servant expected to yield or a high society rival to be defeated for status, they internalize a very dark lesson.
Mm-hmm.
They learn that vulnerability is a fatal liability. So that blank smile Julian develops on the Persian rug, that's not just him being a disciplined kid. That is a hardwired survival mechanism. He is actively shutting off the part of his own humanity that requires warmth and comfort because it's becoming mathematically clear to his young brain that he is never, ever going to get it.
It is an adaptive mechanism to a deeply maladaptive environment. And this exact psychological adaptation is where we see the emergence of what the clinical and organizational psychology literature refers to as the successful psychopath, or the corporate psychopath.
Okay, we need to dig into that.
Because this ties directly into the well-documented concept of the Dark Triad of personality traits. The Dark Triad is a psychological framework that groups together 3 distinct, heavily overlapping, and socially malevolent traits.
I think a lot of people listening have probably heard of the Dark Triad, but maybe don't know the exact components.
First, you have narcissism, which in this clinical context is characterized by bombastic self-promotion, a grandiose sense of entitlement, and an absolute conviction of one's own superiority.
Okay, so the guy who thinks he's the smartest person in the room, always.
Second, you have Machiavellianism. Named after the political philosopher, this is a distinct proclivity for cunning, strategic manipulation, deceit, and a cynical disregard for morality in the pursuit of personal gain.
The ultimate schemer.
The ultimate schemer. And third, you have psychopathy. Now, in this specific organizational context, psychopathy means a cold, callous disregard for the emotions and well-being of others, characterized by high impulsivity and a total absence of remorse or guilt.
Right, and I think we need to clarify that last point for anyone listening, because usually when people hear the word psychopath, they immediately picture a serial killer from a true crime documentary. They picture violent criminality.
Yes, the Hollywood version.
But that is not what the data is pointing to here. We are talking about white-collar psychopathy. We are talking about people who wear $3,000 bespoke suits, sit on executive boards, and have perfectly manicured public images.
The successful psychopath. Unlike violent, incarcerated criminals who often have low impulse control that gets them caught, these individuals are often exceptionally charming, highly educated, and incredibly skilled at impression management.
They know how to play the game.
Better than anyone. This allows them to seamlessly camouflage themselves and thrive in modern business and political environments. Historically, if we look back at corporate structures from 50 or 60 years ago, businesses were slower, more localized, and more stable.
Right. You worked at the same company for 40 years.
In those environments, it was easier for a community or a board of directors to spot these individuals before they did too much damage, because long-term, stable relationships were required for success.
You couldn't just burn bridges every Tuesday.
But the modern, hyper-financialized, ultra-fast-paced corporate landscape doesn't just tolerate these dark triad traits. It actively selects for them.
It rewards them.
Heavily. The affluent, emotionally barren upbringing we just discussed effectively acts as a ruthless filter. It systematically eliminates or sidelines the children who might grow up to pursue humane causes, collaborative science, or community building because those pursuits don't yield extreme power or status.
They don't pay the billionaire dividends.
Right. Conversely, it elevates and arms those who are willing to stop at nothing for profit and control. The system structurally promotes those who view other human beings not as people with lives and families, but merely as disposable resources on a spreadsheet.
It makes complete chilling sense when you break down the incentives. If you were listening to this right now and thinking about your own workplace, you might be picturing that one executive who seems to effortlessly fail upwards while treating their staff terribly.
Everyone knows one.
If you have absolutely no internal mechanism that produces guilt, if you have no problem firing 10,000 people overnight because you view them the exact same way young Julian viewed the shattered porcelain horse, just a mess for someone else to clean up, the stock market often rewards that behavior instantly. Wall Street looks at that callousness, that willingness to gut a workforce to artificially bump quarterly earnings, and they don't call it psychopathy. They rebrand it. They call it bold, decisive leadership or ruthless efficiency.
And that rebranding is the core tragedy of what organizational psychologists call management derailment. What we see in the rigorous research tools designed to measure this, specifically tools like the Hogan Developmental Survey, is that traits that might be considered strengths at a moderate, healthy level become dangerously toxic when they are completely unmoored from reality, accountability, and empathy.
Okay, so tell me more about this Hogan survey. How does it actually measure these dark traits?
Well, to understand how this is measured, we have to look at how the Hogan survey operates. Unlike standard personality tests that measure your bright side traits, how you act when you are at your best.
The version of yourself you put on a resume.
The Hogan Developmental Survey specifically measures your dark side traits. These are the behavioral tendencies that only emerge when a person is under extreme stress, when they are fatigued, or, crucially, when they are placed in positions of unassailable power where they feel they no longer have to pretend.
So it's measuring what you do when the mask slips.
The survey measures scales with names like excitable, skeptical, bold, and mischievous.
Okay, so take that bold scale, for instance.
Yeah, the bold scale, which correlates heavily with narcissism and high self-esteem. We generally view high self-esteem as a universally positive trait in Western society. We tell kids to believe in themselves.
Right, confidence is key.
But the data shows that when exceptionally high self-esteem is built on a fragile, hollow foundation of parental neglect, constant childhood servitude, and a total lifelong lack of accountability, it fundamentally morphs. It stops being self-esteem and turns into hubris.
It mutates.
It mutates into an exaggerated, delusional pride and self-glorification that leads directly to destructive, catastrophic decision-making. The narcissistic leader who scores off the charts on these dark side scales demands absolute loyalty from their subordinates, violently refuses to accept any constructive criticism, and is fundamentally incapable of learning from failure.
Because their ego cannot permit the concept.
Exactly.
Because admitting a failure, admitting a mistake, would require admitting vulnerability. And vulnerability is the exact thing their childhood trauma taught them they can never, ever show. So the psychological void created in the nursery directly translates into this adult pursuit of total, unassailable power. The child who couldn't secure unconditional love seeks absolute control to ensure they are never at the mercy of someone else's judgment again.
Exactly. And because they are placed into an elite, insular subculture populated almost entirely by other individuals raised in the exact same manner, this aberrant behavior is entirely normalized.
They're in an echo chamber of other narcissists.
They attend the same isolated, hyper-competitive, elite prep schools. They filter into the same Ivy League universities. They enter the same closed-door corporate boardrooms and exclusive political networks.
And they form these highly calculated transactional relationships based entirely on mutual self-interest and leverage.
They bend and break the rules without a second thought because they have literally never experienced a reality where the rules apply to them in the same way they apply to the general public. When conflicts arise, they do not resolve them through legal frameworks, ethical considerations, or mutual empathy. They resolve them through sheer power games, plotting, intimidation, and complex intrigue.
So we've established how the psychological void creates a ruthless corporate executive. We see how the Dark Triad traits are weaponized in the boardroom. But a corporation still has a bottom line.
True.
A company could eventually go bankrupt if the CEO makes too many delusional decisions. There is a built-in reality check, however delayed it might be. But what happens when you take that exact same unchecked ego, that exact same Machiavellian operating system, and you pull it out of the corporate world and put it into the political arena?
That is where it gets.
What happens when success is no longer measured by quarterly profits, but by the control of societal narrative and political power? To understand this transition, the source material offers another vivid model for us. Let's step into the Capitol Hill committee room. The heavy mahogany table smells of lemon polish and expensive catered espresso. Thomas, a junior policy analyst who still genuinely believes in the system, slides a dense 40-page economic dossier across the table.
He's done his homework.
And Thomas says, as Senator, his voice is tight with urgency. The data is conclusive. If we pass this deregulation bill, the safety nets vanish. The mills in Ohio will shutter within 6 months. We're looking at a localized economic depression. The foreclosure rate will skyrocket.
So he's laying out the real-world human costs.
But Senator Hayes cuts him off, not by speaking, but by loudly and deliberately checking the notifications on his Patek Philippe watch. He doesn't even glance at the meticulously researched bar charts. Thomas, Senator Hayes murmurs, casually adjusting his silk tie. Markets correct themselves.
Ah, the classic dismissal.
The constituents simply need to adapt to a globalized economy. Besides, the donor base loves this deregulation angle. It's a win for the campaign. He just signs the endorsement without a second thought.
Discarding thousands of livelihoods for a campaign win.
And that evening, the model shifts focus. Thomas drives through his hometown in the Rust Belt. The main street, once vibrant, is now boarded up. The air feels heavy, thick, with a toxic mix of opioid despair and simmering explosive rage.
The reality of the policy.
In the cracked asphalt parking lot of a closed-down diner, a man is screaming into a megaphone to a crowd of hundreds. The man's face is purple with fury, and he is demanding that the crowd help him tear the entire corrupt system down to the bedrock. Thomas grips his steering wheel, his stomach churning with this sick, paralyzing shame. Senator Hayes, sitting in his climate-controlled office, had called this destruction an adaptation. But the crowd in the parking lot called it a war. And Thomas knew right then that the men sitting around the mahogany room had already lost it, entirely and blissfully unaware the siege had even begun.
That is a terrifying image, but it perfectly captures the sociological data.
Because if you are listening to this, logic dictates that having a politician like Senator Hayes, someone completely disconnected, callous, and dripping with Dark Triad traits, would make everyone universally reject him.
You would assume that, yeah.
You would think the public would unite in their disgust for that level of narcissism. But the data on modern voter behavior shows something much more complex and, frankly, much more dangerous.
When we move from individual clinical psychology to massive sociological data sets, the picture becomes incredibly stark. We are looking at comprehensive global research analyzing over 90 top politicians across 40 different national elections.
This isn't just a small sample.
This isn't a small sample size. This is a massive cross-cultural data set. And the researchers are looking specifically at a phenomenon called affective polarization.
Yeah, we definitely need to define that.
To define that term clearly, affective polarization is the deep, visceral, emotional divide and animosity between opposing partisan groups. It is completely different from traditional ideological polarization.
Right, ideological is just we disagree on taxes.
Ideological polarization just means we disagree on tax policy or healthcare. Affective polarization means we view the other side as fundamentally evil, morally bankrupt, and an existential threat to the nation, while feeling intensely, almost blindly loyal to our own side.
It's pure tribalism.
It is measured in these studies using tools like a feeling thermometer, where voters rate their warmth or coldness toward political figures and opposing voters.
Right. And the baseline assumption has always been that a toxic, dark triad politician polarizes the opposition. The common sense thought is that if a highly Machiavellian or psychopathic leader rises to power on the political right, it would infuriate and polarize the voters on the political left, or vice versa. The bad behavior of the enemy makes us hate them more.
That is the universal assumption, but the data reveals a startling, incredibly counterintuitive finding that flips that assumption on its head. Affective polarization. That intense, society-breaking hatred is actually driven most intensely by the dark personality of an in-party candidate. It is the dark, aggressive, narcissistic traits of the leader you already support that act as the primary catalyst driving you to hate the other side more aggressively.
If a politician from the opposing party is acting like a complete narcissist, openly attacking my values, insulting people, and showing zero empathy, that is what makes me furious. Are these global researchers really claiming that my own candidate's bad behavior is the primary driver of my anger? How does that even make sense from a psychological standpoint?
It makes sense when you dive into the mechanics of what cognitive psychologists call motivated reasoning. Human beings are evolutionarily hardwired to protect their tribal identity.
Okay.
We instinctively reject information that contradicts our existing core beliefs, and we preferentially sample behavioral and emotional cues from the people we feel ideologically close to.
So we mirror our own team.
Think about how this plays out in the data. If an out-party leader, the politician you already dislike, acts terribly, exhibits narcissism or lies, your brain doesn't experience a major cognitive shift. You just dismiss it as expected bad behavior.
You just think, well, yeah, they're the bad guy.
Right. It confirms your prior belief that they are bad, but it doesn't fundamentally alter your daily emotional state. However, if your preferred leader, the person you have tied your political identity to, begins to exhibit highly dominant, aggressive, and narcissistic traits, especially during high-conflict, high-stakes periods like national elections, a profound psychological shift occurs within the base.
Because we have to justify it.
Because voters inherently take their behavioral and moral cues from the leaders they align with, they begin to internalize and mirror that hostility. To resolve the cognitive dissonance of supporting a cruel or aggressive leader, the voter subconsciously adopts that cruelty as a necessary and justified weapon against the outgroup. It is an in-house effect. The dark leader doesn't just attack the opposition, they rip the public fabric apart from the inside by validating, endorsing, and amplifying the darkest animosities of their own supporters.
Okay, if I'm translating this into everyday life, it's exactly like sports fans. If you are watching a game and the opposing team's star player commits a flagrant, dirty foul against your team, you scream at the referee. You call them a cheater. But if your star player, the guy whose jersey you were wearing, commits the exact same dirty foul, you don't condemn him. You justify it. You say, he's just playing hard, or he's sending a message, or the other team deserved it for what they did in the first quarter. What the researchers are saying is that we do the exact same thing with toxic political leadership, but the stakes are global instead of a football game. If my leader is showing bombastic self-promotion and callous disregard for democratic norms, and I align with them ideologically, I subconsciously give myself permission to act that way toward my neighbors. I start viewing cruelty as...
And this specific dynamic is deeply terrifying because this research spans across the entire global political spectrum. These extensive surveys used sophisticated linguistic analysis and expert behavioral ratings to measure traits like Machiavellianism and narcissism in leaders all over the world, objectively scaling their rhetoric, their policy decisions, and their public interactions.
So it's not just one country or one party.
No, we see this dynamic play out regardless of the specific political wing, left, right, or center.
And just to pause here for you listening, our goal today, as we dive into this specific deep dive, isn't to take a political stance or endorse any specific critique of the modern political landscape. We are strictly looking at the objective methodology and the data points extracted from this specific global data set, which happens to use prominent contemporary and historical figures as its subjects.
The data objectively evaluates figures from widely varied political systems to ensure the findings aren't localized to just one culture. The researchers utilize data points analyzing leaders like Donald Trump and Joe Biden in the United States, Emmanuel Macron in France, Angela Merkel in Germany, and Viktor Orban in Hungary.
So spanning a ton of different ideologies.
Very diverse. The findings are remarkably consistent across these diverse contexts. When voters feel ideologically close to a candidate, and that specific candidate begins to display high levels of these measured dark triad traits, those voters exhibit a severe, quantifiable uptick in affective polarization.
They get angrier.
They become dramatically more aggressively attached to their in-group identity and vastly more hostile, unforgiving, and uncompromising toward the outgroup. The leader's narcissism acts as a contagion, infecting the political discourse of their followers.
And meanwhile, As this contagion spreads through the electorate, ruining family holidays and causing neighbors to stop speaking to each other, the elites, like our hypothetical Senator Hayes, are sitting in that mahogany room, completely insulated from this ground-level reality.
They don't see the fallout.
They just look at the polling numbers going up. They look at the donor checks clearing. They don't see the man screaming into the megaphone in the diner parking lot. They don't see the communities fracturing. Or if they do happen to see it on the news, their inherent hubris makes them think they can just perfectly control that rage like a thermostat.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you see exactly how the hubris of the elite echo chamber operates and why it is so fundamentally unstable. These political and corporate elites are surrounded entirely by sycophants. Staffers, pollsters, and donors who only tell them exactly what they want to hear, because telling a narcissistic leader the truth is a quick way to end your career. Because these individuals have spent their entire lives, from the nursery onward, bending societal reality to their will through wealth and influence, they honestly believe they can just manage the public through narrative control.
Just spin it.
Right. If the working class economy is failing, if inflation is crushing households, and people are taking to the streets to protest, the disconnected elite do not view it as a fundamental failure of their own leadership or policy.
Because that would threaten their ego?
Their psychological makeup prevents that level of self-reflection. Instead, they view public suffering as a mere annoyance. It is a public relations problem to be managed, spun, or distracted from.
Which explains why we so often see leadership literally try to legislate away dissent or use their immense economic and media power to push a top-down narrative that everything is fine, the economy is booming, even while the people they're speaking to are working 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. They're telling people not to believe their own lying eyes.
And that profound disconnect, that chasm between the lived reality of the citizens and the managed narrative of the elite, leads directly to the explosive rise of populist movements.
You got with the megaphone.
When citizens finally realize that the people in power are living in a completely different, mathematically insulated reality, when they see that the elites are totally indifferent to their suffering and are constantly breaking promises without ever facing consequences, they logically and desperately seek alternatives. They turn away from the mahogany rooms. They turn to the man in the diner parking lot.
Because he's at least looking at them.
The public becomes drawn to extremist rhetoric. Because extremist rhetoric, however dangerous, at least acknowledges their anger. It validates their lived experience, unlike the deaf, polished establishment.
It's so ironic.
The ultimate irony is that the narcissistic elites engineer this societal breakdown through their own callous policies and echo chambers, but their psychopathy perfectly protects them from feeling any empathy or taking any responsibility for the fire they started.
It's a perfect sealed loop of delusion. If you truly believe you are inherently better, smarter, and more deserving than everyone else, and you've spent your whole life having that belief validated by immense wealth and unyielding power, you aren't going to look out the tinted window of your limousine at a protest and say, wow, I really messed up. I failed these people.
Never.
You're going to say, the people are just too ignorant to understand my genius. So we see how this operates domestically. But if a leader fundamentally believes they can bend their own domestic population to their will without any real consequences, they inevitably carry this exact same psychological delusion into the international arena. What happens when they look at a map of the world? To illustrate this, let's look at the third and final composite model from our source material. The heat in the green zone in Baghdad was oppressive, clinging to the skin like a wet wool blanket. But Ambassador Sterling, newly arrived from Washington, looked as crisp and unbothered as a New England autumn in his perfectly tailored linen suit.
Another polished psychopath.
He had arrived direct from a prestigious Georgetown think tank, armed with a thickly bound, highly theoretical thesis titled Accelerated Democratic Implementation. Tariq, his local translator, stood quietly in the corner of the stifling canvas tent as Ambassador Sterling lectured 3 local tribal elders. These elders had survived the brutality of Saddam Hussein, a decade of crippling international sanctions, and endless violent insurgencies. They understood the lethal complexities of their region in their bones.
They know the reality on the ground.
Yet Sterling spoke to them slowly, loudly, and with the exact tone of a disappointed boarding school headmaster reprimanding unruly children.
Just completely condescending.
You must understand, Sterling said, waving a perfectly manicured hand dismissively when the oldest elder tried to explain the centuries-old sectarian fault lines that a new border policy would ignite. Our blueprint circumvents these archaic disputes. We are building a modern, globalized coalition. You need to look at the bigger picture.
He's not listening at all.
Not a bit. As Sterling spoke, he didn't even look at the elders' faces. He looked down, admiring his own reflection on the polished surface of the heavy wooden table they had imported for the tent. Tariq translated the arrogant, hollow words into Arabic, watching the elders' eyes darken. He watched their expression shift from polite, exhausted patience to cold, hard, unforgiving contempt.
They see right through him.
When the brief meeting ended and the elders departed in silence, Sterling stood up and clapped Tariq hard on the shoulder. Splendid progress today, don't you think? Sterling beamed, utterly and completely blind to the reality of the room. Tariq forced a nod, the ash of a ruined nation dry in his throat, knowing intimately that the ambassador's terrifying narcissism hadn't just insulted the elders, it had just guaranteed the next decade of bloodshed.
That narrative perfectly, tragically captures the essence of what geopolitical researchers and former policymakers like David Owen, who extensively studied this term, the hubris syndrome in foreign policy.
Hubris syndrome.
When the malignant narcissism we tracked from the nursery to the boardroom and into the Senate finally enters the highest realm of international relations, the consequences cease to be merely economic or political. They become catastrophic, measured in human lives and collapsed states.
Because the scale is just so massive.
These leaders approach the immensely complex, highly volatile global stage with the exact same absolute entitlement they experienced as children. They operate under the delusion that they can simply dictate terms to sovereign nations, draw lines on a map, and the rest of the world will rush to oblige them out of awe for their power.
Because in their lived experience, why wouldn't the world fall in line? Every paid servant, every corporate employee, every sycophantic domestic ally has always yielded to them. So when Ambassador Sterling drops his beautifully bound blueprint on the table in Baghdad, he genuinely, cognitively cannot compute the idea that these tribal elders might have their own agency, their own history, and their own power that exists outside of his framework.
It is a fundamental failure of theory of mind on a geopolitical scale. And the historical data bears this out rigorously. Research into the trajectory and duration of wars reveals that highly narcissistic leaders consistently experience longer, more drawn-out, and more devastating conflicts. This happens because a narcissistic leader operates under a completely different incentive structure than a pragmatic one. They constantly raise their demands mid-conflict, and their strategic decision-making is focused entirely on protecting their own ego, maintaining their infallible self-image, and avoiding public humiliation rather than on objective, on-the-ground reality. When confronted with bad news from the front lines, when the initial strategy clearly fails, a narcissist fundamentally fails to adjust.
Because adjusting means admitting the initial strategy was flawed. And if the strategy was flawed, the leader is flawed. And to the narcissist, that is cognitive death.
Precisely. Let's look at the objective research comparing different leaders in historical contexts. Extensive historical and linguistic analyses of presidential decision-making show that a leader like Richard Nixon, whose psychological profile scored highly on these dark side traits, burned immense human and economic resources extending the conflict in Vietnam.
Even when it was clearly failing.
He did this despite repeated, explicit early warnings from his own military and intelligence advisors, questioning his objectives and showing the war was unwinnable on his terms. His decisions were heavily driven by an internal need to protect his image of toughness and achieve a peace with honor that validated his ego, regardless of the staggering death toll.
Okay, so contrast that for us.
Conversely, the same dataset points to leaders scoring significantly lower in measured narcissism. The researchers cite Joe Biden regarding the deeply unpopular but finalized withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, who are more willing to take a massive, short-term public opinion and reputational hit in order to end an unwinnable or strategically unviable conflict.
Again, we're observing this purely through the lens of the data.
Purely the data. The less narcissistic a leader is, the more capable they are of prioritizing objective, harsh reality over the maintenance of their own grandiosity.
It's like they are playing a high-stakes game of chess, but they absolutely refuse to acknowledge the fundamental rule that the opponent's pieces can actually move. When the opponent makes a move they didn't anticipate, or when the world just doesn't magically comply with their brilliant blueprint, they don't step back and change their strategy. They just start shouting the exact same commands louder. They double down. But why? If they were supposedly so smart, if they have all these elite degrees, why can't they just look at the board and self-correct?
This raises an important question, perhaps the most important question about the architecture of elite delusion. To understand why they can't self-correct, we have to look at the fundamental, foundational architecture of the narcissist psyche. As we established, their entire worldview is predicated on their own absolute supremacy. Therefore, their psyche is fundamentally incapable of coping with a reality where its desires are frustrated by external forces.
So they literally can't process it.
When a foreign policy initiative fails, or a geopolitical adversary pushes back successfully, the narcissistic leader doesn't view it as a strategic error, a miscalculation, or a complex geopolitical challenge to be solved rationally. They perceive it as an intolerable, deeply personal insult to their ego. The failure is internalized as an attack on their core identity.
So instead of reassessing the situation, gathering new intelligence, and negotiating, they lash out. They throw a geopolitical tantrum. They try to bash in the heads of anyone who doesn't comply, using economic sanctions or military force just to make them understand who is really in charge.
And this incredibly dangerous dynamic reaches critical mass in what political scientists call personalist governments, or entrenched autocracies. When one individual rules absolutely and systematically silences all opposition, think of historical and contemporary figures analyzed in the data like Saddam Hussein or Vladimir Putin, the hubris syndrome becomes an impenetrable concrete fortress.
Because there's no pushback.
In a democracy, there is at least some institutional friction. But in an autocracy, the leader surrounds themselves entirely with terrified sycophants. They literally become incapable of processing bad news because no general or intelligence director is brave enough to deliver it.
Delivering bad news to a malignant narcissist with absolute power is frequently a death sentence.
So the leader lives in a completely manufactured fictional reality where their every whim is brilliant, their military is invincible, and their enemies are weak. They make catastrophic decisions based on data designed purely to flatter them.
Yeah. What happens to the people on the exact opposite side of that mahogany table? Think about the foreign diplomats, the traditional allies, the adversaries who actually have to deal with this person on a daily basis. At first, they probably try to use standard logic. They think, okay, this leader is acting erratically, but they are still a head of state. If we just stick to the established norms of international law, if we keep treating them like rational adults, if we offer them off-ramps, they'll eventually come to their senses and see the mutual benefit of cooperation.
But they never do come to their senses. Because the narcissist is not operating within the same framework of reality, and they do not value mutual benefit, they only value total domination. They will demand concessions, manipulate treaties, lie directly to the faces of allies, and backstab partners without a second thought. And then, astonishingly, they will turn around and expect the other party to hold up their end of the bargain as if nothing happened.
It's madness.
The definitive breaking point arrives when allies and adversaries alike collectively realize that rational negotiation is mathematically impossible. You simply cannot reason with an entity that views you not as a sovereign equal, but merely as an instrument for its own aggrandizement.
It's a complete and utter collapse of diplomacy. The rest of the world eventually realizes there is no rational, safe way to deal with this elite leadership. They start quietly, methodically cutting themselves off. You see deep diplomatic and economic isolation. Countries start dropping the reserve currency, they bypass the established trade routes, they form their own localized coalitions, and they freeze the narcissist out of the global future.
Which leads exactly to the compounding structural collapse we're examining. You have the internal domestic societal collapse driven by the intense affective polarization and the calculated economic neglect of the working class we discussed earlier. The society is literally tearing itself apart from the inside because the elites have intentionally incentivized hostility and completely ignored the material daily needs of the public.
And simultaneously, right as the inside is collapsing, you had the total collapse of external relations. The endless ego-driven wars and the unbearable diplomatic hubris have completely isolated the nation on the global stage. These cascading problems don't just happen at the same time, they amplify each other. The internal economy chokes because the external trade alliances crumble. The infrastructure decays because the budget is burned on unwinnable foreign conflicts. The system begins to eat itself alive.
And yet, bringing it full circle back to the precise imagery we started with, the gilded cage remains entirely intact for the very few it was designed to protect.
The ones who started it all.
The elite remain perfectly satisfied. They continue to reside in their isolated mansions, their highly secured gated communities, and their private islands, completely insulated from the devastating consequences of their own actions. They watch their imaginary wealth rise in digital offshore bank accounts, fully believing their own managed media narratives that the economy is fine and that everything is perfectly under control. The perfectly engineered machine functions exactly as intended for them, even as it cannibalizes the rest of the world to keep the gears turning.
The ultimate tragedy of the narcissistic elite isn't just that they build empires on the suffering of others. It is that when the walls finally cave in and the fires they started reach their own doorsteps, they will stand amidst the ashes of a ruined world and honestly believe they were the victims.